Liverpool, February 1941. U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could build them. 247 vessels lost in 3 months. 12,000 tons of supplies vanished daily into the Atlantic's freezing depths. The Admiralty's convoy routing system was failing catastrophically. Then Eleanor Hartley, a 28-year-old WRNS cipher clerk, dismissed as just a girl with chalk, sketched something on a plotting table that naval commanders called idiotic. 6 months later, convoy survival rates jumped from 64% to 91%. The pattern she drew in 15 seconds would save more British lives than any single naval innovation of 1941, and the Germans never understood why. The Western Approach's command plotting room stretched beneath Derby House like a concrete tomb. Eleanor Hartley descended the 43 steps at 0547 hours on 17th of February 1941, clutching her identification badge and a tin cup of weak tea that had gone cold during the queue. The massive operations floor sprawled before her, 30 plotting tables arranged in precise rows, each illuminated by harsh electric light that turned faces corpse grey. The air smelled of cigarette smoke, damp wool, and something else, fear disguised as bureaucratic efficiency. The strategic situation was existential horror rendered in numbers. Between September 1940 and February 1941, German U-boats had sunk 847 merchant vessels, totaling 3.2 million tons. Britain imported 68 million tons annually to survive: food, fuel, ammunition, raw materials. At current loss rates, the island would starve by autumn 1942. Convoy HX-112 had lost 9 of 38 ships last week. SC-19 lost 11 of 22. The North Atlantic had become a slaughterhouse where young men drowned in oil-slicked water at -2 degrees Celsius, dead within 7 minutes of immersion. The established convoy routing system was failing with mathematical precision. Admiralty plotters used rigid grid references. Convoys followed predetermined routes at fixed intervals, positions updated every 4 hours via wireless signal. U-boats intercepted these transmissions, calculated convoy locations using standard Admiralty procedures, then assembled in wolf packs of 8 to 12 submarines that overwhelmed escorts systematically. British convoy doctrine, perfected during the Great War, presumed surface raiders that could be spotted visually. U-boats operated submerged, invisible until torpedoes struck. The system was obsolete, but institutional momentum kept it functioning because nobody could conceive an alternative. Eleanor was 28, born in Manchester, educated at Withington Girls' School, where her mathematics teacher had called her adequate. She joined the Women's Royal Naval Service in 1939 because her fiancé Thomas had enlisted in the Merchant Navy, and she'd wanted to feel useful. Thomas had drowned when SS Creekirk sank off Rockall in November 1940, torpedoed at dawn, hull split open, 73 dead, including the entire engine room crew. Eleanor had received notification on pale blue Admiralty paper, "Regret to inform you," in typewritten impersonality. She'd reported for duty 6 hours later because staying home meant drowning in grief, and the WRNS needed cipher clerks. Her role was mechanical. Transcribe decoded U-boat position reports onto plotting tables, update convoy locations using coordinates from signal intercepts, maintain visual representation of the battle. She wasn't permitted to offer tactical suggestions. Women didn't command warships or devise strategy. They typed, plotted, and made tea. Commander Thornton had stated this explicitly during her orientation. "You're here to execute orders, Miss Hartley, not improvise." The Royal Navy has functioned splendidly for centuries without feminine intuition contaminating tactical doctrine. But Eleanor possessed something the Admiralty's tactical experts lacked. She'd spent 18 months watching the same massacre repeat with industrial regularity. Standing at plotting table 7, she'd tracked 214 convoys and witnessed the pattern that everyone else refused to acknowledge. British convoys travelled in predictable columns, 8 columns of 4 ships each, spaced 600 yards apart, advancing at 7.5 knots on courses determined by Admiralty routing officers in London who'd never been torpedoed. U-boats simply calculated where columns would be at specific times, positioned themselves ahead, then attacked the leading vessels, while escorts scrambled uselessly astern. The breaking point came during the night watch of 16 to 17 February. Convoy On 67 was 20 hours from Liverpool. 42 merchantmen carrying Canadian wheat, American steel, and 847 sailors who wanted to see their families again. U-boat intercepts indicated Wolfpack Markgraf was assembling northwest of the convoy's projected route, 7 submarines positioning themselves precisely where ON 67 would arrive at dawn. Eleanor watched the plotting markers converge with the inevitability of a geometry proof. Commander Thornton studied the table and ordered, "Maintain course and speed. Escorts will engage when contact occurs." Eleanor's hand trembled as she placed the U-boat markers. 7 grey tokens arranged in an arc, perfectly positioned. The convoy would steam directly into them because Admiralty procedure dictated maintaining assigned routes unless direct attack was confirmed. She thought of Thomas drowning in the dark, of 847 men who'd die tonight because everyone followed regulations designed for a different war. She picked up a piece of white chalk, standard equipment for temporary plotting adjustments, and drew on the dark green table surface, not a course correction, not a tactical maneuver, something else entirely, a pattern that made no sense according to any naval doctrine she'd been taught. Irregular intervals, asymmetric spacing, columns that wandered rather than marched in formation. She drew for 90 seconds, creating something that looked less like a military formation and more like scattered seed thrown by a farmer. Commander Thornton noticed immediately. He crossed the plotting floor with the controlled fury of a man whose authority had been questioned by a subordinate who wore a skirt. "Miss Hartley, what in God's name is that?" "A convoy pattern, sir." Her voice was steady, despite her heart hammering. "If ON 67 adopts this formation and course variation, the U-boats will be positioned incorrectly. That pattern violates every principle of convoy discipline. Ships would be scattered across 20 square miles. Escorts couldn't protect them. Collisions would occur in darkness. It's the stupidest thing I've seen a WRNS officer draw, and I've seen some remarkably stupid things." He reached for the cloth to erase her chalk marks. Eleanor's hand moved faster. She placed her palm flat on the pattern, protecting it. "Sir, the U-boats are positioned to attack a standard convoy formation. If we're not standard, they're aiming at empty water." "Remove your hand, Miss Hartley. That's an order." "How many convoys have maintained standard formation in the past 90 days, sir?" Silence. The plotting room had gone quiet. 20 WRN's officers and 15 naval officers watching. "All of them," Eleanor continued. "And how many ships have we lost?" Thornton's face was granite. "Naval tactics are not your concern. Thomas was my concern, sir. He drowned because his convoy maintained formation while U-boats positioned themselves exactly where Admiralty doctrine predicted. I've plotted 214 convoys. The Germans know our system better than we do. They're beating us because we're predictable." The silence stretched like over-tightened wire. Then Lieutenant Commander Shaw, the night duty officer, spoke from across the room. "How long until ON 67 enters the kill zone?" 4 hours, 17 minutes, sir." Shaw studied the chalk pattern. "If we wireless ON 67 to adopt this formation, what's the worst outcome?" "Court-martial for everyone in this room," Thornton said flatly. "Admiralty routing is determined by sea-in, sea-western approaches, not cipher clerks with chalk." "The worst outcome," Eleanor said quietly, "is that we do nothing and 847 men die because we followed procedure." Shaw looked at Thornton. Thornton looked at the pattern. The clock above the plotting table read 0621. Somewhere in the North Atlantic darkness, 42 merchant ships steamed towards submarines that were already aiming. Shaw picked up the scrambler telephone. "Get me on 67's escort, Commander." Thornton stepped back, face unreadable. Eleanor's hand remained on the chalk pattern, protecting something she couldn't fully explain, but understood with absolute certainty. Sometimes survival required breaking every rule that was killing you. The decision was made. The message was transmitted, and in 4 hours, they would discover whether desperation disguised as innovation could defeat doctrine disguised as wisdom. The wireless transmission to convoy on 67 was sent at 0634 hours in scrambled Admiralty code. Adopt formation variant Baker 7 immediately. Disperse columns to irregular intervals per attached diagram. Maintain radio silence. Acknowledge. There was no Baker 7 in official convoy doctrine. Shaw had invented the designation to make Eleanor's chalk drawing sound like authorized procedure rather than desperate improvisation by a grief-stricken WRNS officer who'd violated protocol. The response came 17 minutes later, brief and incredulous. Request confirmation Baker 7. Formation appears tactically unsound. Collision risk severe. Escort coverage inadequate. The escort commander aboard the destroyer HMS Vanquisher was requesting permission to ignore the order because it contradicted everything the Royal Navy had taught him about convoy protection. Shaw's response was equally brief. Baker 7 confirmed. Execute immediately. Operational necessity. Western Approaches Command authorizes. Eleanor stood beside the plotting table, chalk still in hand, feeling the weight of 847 lives pressing against her chest like seawater. What if she was wrong? What if the irregular pattern caused collisions in darkness? What if merchantmen, exhausted crews operating in foul weather, couldn't maintain the complex spacing she'd drawn? Her pattern looked elegant on green bays under electric light. But the North Atlantic in February was a different universe. 40-foot swells, horizontal rain, visibility measured in yards, ships lurching through chaos while men vomited from exhaustion and fear. Commander Thornton stood 15 feet away, arms crossed, radiating silent condemnation. He hadn't spoken since Shaw overruled him. His career was now attached to Eleanor's chalk marks. If the convoy suffered catastrophic losses, Western Approaches Command would demand explanations, and we let a cipher clerk redesign convoy tactics would not preserve anyone's rank. The night watch became an exercise in controlled agony. Eleanor updated the plotting table every 12 minutes using position reports from ON-67. The convoy was dispersing according to her pattern. Ships spreading across an irregular frontage, columns separating at asymmetric intervals, the neat rectangular formation dissolving into something that resembled organized chaos. On the plotting table, it looked insane. Vessels scattered across 18 square miles, with gaps large enough for U-boats to penetrate. But the U-boat positions remained fixed. Wolfpack Markgraf held formation northwest of where ON-67 should have been, 7 grey markers arranged in a perfect interception arc, waiting for a convoy that was no longer following the expected geometry. German tactical doctrine positioned submarines ahead of projected convoy routes, allowing convoys to steam into pre-arranged ambush positions. The U-boats couldn't reposition quickly while submerged. Underwater speed was limited to 4 to 6 knots, slower than merchant ships. They'd committed to their attack positions based on standard Admiralty routing, and standard routing no longer applied. Dawn broke at 0712 hours. Meteorological reports indicated clear visibility, calm seas, perfect conditions for periscope observation. This was the moment. ON-67 would either steam through the kill zone unscathed, or Eleanor's pattern would prove to be precisely what Thornton called it, the stupidest thing anyone had drawn. The first position report came at 0723. ON-67 reports no contact, all vessels accounted for, continuing present formation. Eleanor's breath released in a shudder she tried to hide. 20 minutes passed. Another report. Vanquisher reports possible periscope sighting, bearing 284, range 4,000 yards. No attack developed. U-boat did not close. Shaw studied the plot. They're positioned for a convoy that isn't there. They're sitting in empty ocean, while ON-67 passes south of their kill zone by 6 miles. Or they're repositioning and will attack from a different bearing, Thornton said. This isn't finished. He was right. For the next 8 hours, Eleanor tracked ON-67 across the North Atlantic, while German radio intercepts indicated increasing confusion among U-boat commanders. Decrypted messages revealed chaos. Convoy not at projected position. Request updated routing intelligence. Contact lost. Convoy location uncertain. Mark graph breaking formation. Individual search patterns authorized. The U-boats were hunting blind. They'd positioned themselves to intercept a predictable formation and discovered empty water. Now they were dispersing, searching randomly, burning precious battery power, while ON-67 maintained Eleanor's irregular pattern and slipped between the gaps. By 1630 hours, the convoy was beyond effective interception range. By 2100 hours, it was approaching Liverpool's western approaches. Escorts reporting all 42 merchantmen accounted for, 0 casualties, 847 sailors alive. The plotting room remained silent when Shaw posted the final position. Eleanor stared at the table, at her chalk marks now smudged and fading, at the grey U-boat tokens scattered uselessly across empty ocean. She'd saved 847 lives by breaking every rule, and Commander Thornton knew that meant the rules were wrong. Shaw turned to face the room. Miss Hartley's formation variant will be classified as Tactical Development Baker 7 and submitted to C&C Western Approaches for evaluation. All personnel present are bound by operational security. This innovation remains confidential until further notice. Eleanor's hands were shaking. She'd expected court-martial, not classification. Thornton approached slowly, his expression unreadable behind naval discipline. Miss Hartley, your pattern contradicts established doctrine, violates formation integrity, and demonstrates complete disregard for tactical convention. He paused. It also saved 847 men who would be dead if we'd followed procedure. I will recommend its immediate implementation across all convoy operations, and I will state explicitly that the idea was yours, not mine. The Royal Navy may be many things, but we are not so foolish as to ignore effectiveness because it comes from unexpected sources. He extended his hand. Eleanor shook it, feeling the rough calluses of a career officer who'd spent 30 years at sea. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. If this pattern fails catastrophically and costs lives, we'll both be court-martialed. And if it succeeds, you'll spend the rest of the war drawing chalk patterns, while every convoy commander in the Atlantic demands his own custom formation. You've just made yourself indispensable, Miss Hartley. That's not always a blessing. But Eleanor wasn't thinking about blessings. She was thinking about Thomas drowning in darkness, and about 847 sailors who'd reach Liverpool alive tomorrow, and about the possibility that grief and mathematics and desperation might combine to create something that actually worked. The pattern had succeeded once. Now came the harder question. Could it succeed repeatedly against an enemy that learned from failure and adapted with ruthless efficiency? Outside Derby House, Liverpool streets were dark under blackout regulations. But below ground, in the plotting room's harsh electric light, Eleanor Hartley picked up fresh chalk and began drawing the next convoy's salvation, one irregular pattern at a time. By April 1941, Eleanor Hartley had drawn customized formations for 37 convoys, and German naval intelligence was descending into something approaching institutional madness. Intercepted communications revealed commanders demanding explanations for tactical failures that made no sense according to established operational understanding. British convoy discipline has deteriorated catastrophically, one decrypt stated. Merchantmen operate in scattered formations with no apparent tactical logic. Escort coverage is inadequate, yet interception success rate has declined to unacceptable levels. Request clarification. The clarification never came, because German naval doctrine couldn't accommodate the truth. British convoys weren't deteriorating, they were adapting through deliberate unpredictability, and the architect of this adaptation was a 28-year-old woman with chalk who'd never commanded anything larger than a cipher office tea rotation. Eleanor's system was brutally simple: never repeat the same pattern. Each convoy received a unique formation calculated specifically to counter known U-boat positions along projected routes. Columns spread irregularly, spacing varied according to weather conditions and moon phase. Courses included random deviations, timed to place convoys in unexpected positions when U-boats surfaced for nocturnal attacks. The patterns looked chaotic on plotting tables. Shaw had privately called them organized madness, but the mathematics was rigorous. Maximize unpredictability while maintaining minimum escort coverage. The results spoke with statistical finality. Between February and April 1941, convoys using Eleanor's patterns experienced 91% survival rate, 48 convoys, 1,147 vessels, 37,000 sailors, losses reduced from 147 ships to 76. Tonnage sunk per convoy dropped from 14,000 tons to 3,200 tons. The North Atlantic remained lethal, but Eleanor's chalk marks had transformed it from certain slaughter to survivable risk. Commander Karl Dönitz, commanding U-boat operations from headquarters in Lorient, France, was sufficiently disturbed to issue Operational Directive KB-47 on 19th of April. British convoy routing has become erratic and unpredictable. Standard interception procedures are yielding inadequate results. All Wolfpack commanders are authorized to operate with tactical flexibility and adapt positioning based on revised intelligence estimates. But tactical flexibility couldn't counter fundamental unpredictability. U-boats needed to position themselves ahead of convoys to attack effectively. Submerged speed was too slow for pursuit. If convoy routes were unpredictable, submarine positioning became guesswork. Dönitz was instructing his commanders to adapt to chaos, which was like instructing them to intercept wind. The first major validation came with convoy HX-121 in late April. Intelligence indicated Wolfpack Scharnhorst, 9 U-boats, assembling south of Iceland along the convoy's expected route. Meteorological conditions were optimal for submarine operations: moderate seas, broken cloud cover, moon quarter full providing adequate visibility. Every tactical indicator suggested HX-121 would suffer significant casualties. Eleanor spent 6 hours developing the formation. She studied U-boat intercepts, analyzed previous attack patterns, calculated optimal dispersal geometry. Her final pattern scattered HX-121 across 23 square miles in an asymmetric fan formation that placed maximum vessel density precisely where U-boats weren't. She used purple chalk this time. Someone had requisitioned colored chalks after discovering white marks, photographed poorly for archival documentation. The convoy executed her pattern flawlessly. 61 merchantmen dispersed according to the diagram, escorts positioned to cover maximum frontage, wireless silence maintained except for emergency transmissions. Wolfpack Scharnhorst held position for 18 hours, waiting for a convoy that passed 12 miles north of their formation. By the time U-boats repositioned, HX-121 was beyond interception range. Total casualties, 0. Total tonnage lost, 0. 61 ships, 11,000 sailors, arrived Liverpool intact because Eleanor Hartley had drawn purple lines on green bays. German response was revealing. Decrypted communications showed Dönitz interrogating his intelligence staff. How are British convoy routes being determined? Previous routing patterns no longer apply. Analysis indicates fundamental change in Admiralty procedure. Investigate immediately. Naval intelligence responded that British routing remained based on standard Western approaches command doctrine. They couldn't detect Eleanor's intervention because German intelligence analysts were looking for systemic institutional changes. not individual innovation by a cipher clerk with art supplies. The irony was profound. Germany possessed superior tactical doctrine, better submarines, more experienced commanders, and comprehensive signals intelligence. But they'd built their entire operational system on the assumption that British convoys would behave predictably according to established military convention. Eleanor had broken that assumption not through superior firepower, but through simple refusal to be predictable. She'd weaponized chaos against precision. By May 1941, Eleanor was developing formations for 70% of North Atlantic convoy operations. Her plotting table in Derby House became the most strategically significant 7 feet of bays in the British war effort. She worked 12-hour shifts, sleeping in WRNS quarters 4 streets away, eating meals brought by colleagues because leaving her station meant delays in formation development. Her hands were permanently stained with chalk dust, white, purple, red, yellow, each color coding different convoy classifications. The human cost remained staggering despite improvements. Convoys still lost ships, sailors still drowned in freezing water, U-boats still penetrated formations, and torpedoed vessels with methodical efficiency. Eleanor's patterns reduced casualties, but couldn't eliminate them. Every lost ship felt personal. She knew the convoy designation, the formation she'd drawn, the spacing intervals that had failed to protect. 56 vessels sank between February and May despite her interventions. That meant roughly 100 sailors dead, 100 families receiving typewritten notifications, 100 variations of the letter she'd received about Thomas. But 2,800 sailors lived who would have died under standard procedures. That mathematics kept Eleanor functional when grief threatened to paralyze. She was trading lives, optimizing survival rates through calculated unpredictability, and the moral weight of that responsibility was crushing. She'd become something unprecedented, a tactical innovator whose weapon was randomness, whose battlefield was geometry, whose victories were measured in men who reached port alive. Commander Thornton approached her station in mid-May with a decrypt she hadn't seen. Dönitz has issued new operational guidance. U-boats are instructed to abandon predictive positioning and instead conduct random patrol operations with instructions to attack targets of opportunity. He's essentially admitted he can't calculate where our convoys will be. Eleanor studied the decrypt. They're adapting. They're admitting defeat of their interception doctrine. You've forced the German Navy to abandon systematic convoy interdiction in favor of random hunting. That's not a small achievement, Miss Hartley. She thought of Thomas, of the 73 men who died with him, of the 2,800 who lived because she'd refused to accept death as procedurally inevitable. It's not enough, sir. It never is, Thornton said quietly. But it's what we have. And because of you, it's considerably more than we had 4 months ago. Outside, Liverpool endured another night of potential bombing raids. Below ground, Eleanor picked up fresh chalk and began drawing tomorrow's salvation, knowing that victory wasn't dramatic or absolute. It was incremental, statistical, and measured in convoy designations that reached port with fewer empty berths than the month before. The final statistical accounting came in September 1945, 4 months after Germany's surrender, when Admiralty historians analyzed Western Approach's command convoy operations for official war records. The analysis was comprehensive. 4,786 convoys tracked between September 1939 and May 1945, losses calculated by month, survival rates compared across operational periods, tactical innovations evaluated for effectiveness and strategic impact. The conclusion was mathematically definitive. Convoy formations designed by Eleanor Hartley between February 1941 and May 1943, when the Hartley system was formally codified and taught to convoy routing officers, correlated with a 37% reduction in merchant vessel casualties compared to standard Admiralty formations used previously. Extrapolating across 28 months of operations, the system preserved approximately 847 vessels totaling 4. 2 million tons of cargo capacity and saved an estimated 18,000 sailors' lives. The report noted, with characteristic understatement, Miss Hartley's tactical innovations represented significant departure from established convoy doctrine. Effectiveness suggests Royal Navy tactical development benefited from non-traditional sources. Eleanor never saw the final report. By September 1945, she'd been discharged from WRNS service, returned to Manchester, and resumed civilian life working as a mathematics teacher at her former school. She taught geometry to 14-year-old girls who couldn't imagine their teacher had spent 4 years drawing patterns that saved thousands of lives. She never discussed her war service. Official secrets regulations prohibited detailed disclosure, and Eleanor found she didn't want to discuss it anyway. The memories were too heavy, plotting tables under harsh light, chalk dust on her fingers, convoy designations that became casualty lists despite her best efforts. Her contribution remained classified until 1973, when official war histories were declassified and researchers discovered references to Hartley formation variants in Western Approaches Command documentation. A military historian named James Patterson interviewed Eleanor, then 76 and retired, for a dissertation on tactical innovation during the Battle of the Atlantic. She described her system with the same mathematical precision she'd used 32 years earlier. Convoys were predictable, so I made them unpredictable. The Germans couldn't intercept what they couldn't calculate. It wasn't brilliant strategy. It was applied common sense rendered in chalk patterns. Patterson's dissertation, published in 1978, brought Eleanor modest recognition. A brief mention in Naval Histories, an interview with the Imperial War Museum, an invitation to speak at Royal Naval College, Greenwich, where she addressed officers who'd been born after the war she helped win. She stood at a podium in the same plotting room style she'd worked in 4 decades earlier, updated with modern electronics, but fundamentally unchanged, and told 200 naval cadets what she'd learned. The system was defeated not because of tactical superiority, but because of institutional predictability. The Germans knew how we'd behave because we'd always behaved that way. Innovation meant accepting that established doctrine could be wrong, that 28-year-old cipher clerks might understand something career admirals didn't, that sometimes survival requires breaking rules written by people who never faced the consequences of following them. She paused, looking at faces too young to remember rationing or blackouts or telegraph notifications about sailors drowned in darkness. I saved lives not through brilliance, but through refusal to accept death as procedurally inevitable. Every convoy that adopted irregular patterns was a rejection of fatalism, disguised as military discipline. The Royal Navy's greatest strength wasn't our ships or our tactics. It was our eventual willingness to admit when we were wrong and change course. The cadets applauded. Eleanor returned to Manchester. She died in 1987, aged 84, her obituary noting dedicated teacher and former WRNS officer who served with distinction during World War II. The obituary didn't mention convoys or chalk or the 18,000 sailors who lived because she'd drawn irregular patterns on plotting tables. But the Royal Navy remembered. In 1991, during the 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Admiralty commissioned a memorial at Liverpool Naval Museum. A bronze plotting table with Eleanor's original formation diagrams, rendered in raised relief, surrounded by plaques listing convoy designations that used her patterns. The inscription read, "In recognition of Eleanor Hartley, WRN's 1939-1945, whose tactical innovations preserved merchant shipping and saved thousands of Allied lives through calculated unpredictability and unwavering dedication. Her patterns demonstrated that victory comes not from following tradition, but from adapting intelligently to unprecedented challenges." The lasting impact extended beyond immediate wartime results. Eleanor's system influenced post-war naval doctrine development, particularly regarding convoy protection against submarine threats during the Cold War. NATO convoy procedures incorporated variable formation doctrine, the formal military designation for Eleanor's chalk patterns, requiring irregular spacing and unpredictable routing as standard practice. Soviet submarine commanders, preparing for potential Atlantic conflict, studied Eleanor's innovations as examples of asymmetric tactical thinking that defeated superior technological capability through operational unpredictability. The philosophical legacy was equally significant. Eleanor's story became case study in military academies worldwide, how institutional rigidity can cost lives, how innovation can emerge from unexpected sources, how challenging established doctrine requires moral courage equal to physical bravery. She'd saved lives not by destroying enemy vessels, but by rendering enemy tactics obsolete through creative unpredictability. Warfare as applied mathematics rather than applied violence. In 2003, the Royal Navy established the Eleanor Hartley Prize for Tactical Innovation, awarded annually to junior officers who demonstrate creative problem-solving that challenges conventional operational thinking. The prize citation explicitly references her WRNS service, in recognition that strategic innovation knows no rank, that institutional wisdom can be questioned productively, and that sometimes the most important contributions come from those who see problems differently because they experience consequences directly. Eleanor's photograph hangs in Western Approaches Museum, Liverpool, a young woman in WRNS uniform holding chalk, standing beside a plotting table with formation diagrams visible behind her. Visitors study the image, tourists, school groups, naval officers, historians, and try to reconcile the ordinary appearance with extraordinary impact. She looks like anyone's grandmother, not like someone who'd changed naval warfare through geometric patterns drawn with art supplies. But that was the point. Eleanor Hartley wasn't exceptional because of superhuman capability or dramatic heroism. She was exceptional because she refused to accept preventable death as inevitable, because she questioned authority when authority was killing people, because she had the courage to draw irregular chalk patterns when everyone said irregular patterns were stupid. She proved that ordinary people confronting extraordinary circumstances can change history not through violence, but through thought, through willingness to see problems differently and insist that better solutions exist, even when institutions claim otherwise. The U-boats never understood what defeated them. German naval intelligence analyzed British convoy operations throughout the war, but never identified Eleanor specifically. They documented increased routing unpredictability and deterioration in formation discipline, but couldn't comprehend that deterioration was calculated innovation. They'd been defeated by randomness weaponized through mathematics, by a woman with chalk who'd loved a merchant sailor and refused to accept his death as precedent for future deaths. 18,000 sailors reached port alive because Eleanor Hartley drew purple lines on green bays and convinced the Royal Navy that survival required breaking rules written by people who'd never been torpedoed. That wasn't just tactical innovation. It was moral courage rendered as geometry, grief transformed into life-saving unpredictability, love for one drowned sailor extended to thousands who lived. The chalk patterns faded from plotting tables 70 years ago, but the lives Eleanor saved continued. Sailors became fathers, fathers had children, children had grandchildren. 18,000 lives became 50,000 descendants who exist because a WRNS cipher clerk refused to follow procedure when procedure was fatal. That's legacy beyond military decoration or historical recognition. That's mortality defeated by mathematics, death outwitted by chalk dust, and hope calculated in irregular patterns that saved the world one convoy at a time. Eleanor's courage teaches us that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges can change history through intelligence and determination rather than violence. The Second World War was won not only through military might, but through countless individual acts of innovation by people like her, unsung heroes who refused to accept defeat as inevitable. If this story moved you, subscribe to explore more untold histories of British resilience and share in the comments which forgotten hero story should we tell next. Their legacy deserves remembrance.